You think you know what justice looks like until it's standing right in front of you, and you don't recognize it. The words hung in the air like a warning no one understood yet. Inside a busy bank in downtown Chicago, the morning rush had settled into an uneasy quiet, the kind where every soft sound seemed louder than it should be. People stood in line, phones in hand, tapping screens, checking accounts, waiting for their turn like any other day. But something felt off. Officer Mark Reynolds adjusted his stance near the teller line, his posture rigid, his eyes scanning with quiet authority. His badge caught the overhead lights, reflecting a sense of control that seemed to belong more to the room than the people in it. Then his gaze locked onto her. A black woman, standing calmly at the counter, her expression composed, her hands resting lightly on the edge as she spoke to the teller. To anyone else, she was just another customer. But not to Mark. He took a step closer, his voice cutting through the soft hum of the bank. "Is there a problem here?" The teller hesitated, glancing between them, uncertainty flickering across his face. The woman didn't turn around right away. Instead, she finished her sentence, her tone even, controlled, like she had all the time in the world. Only then did she slowly face the officer, her eyes steady, unreadable. "No problem," she said quietly. But Mark wasn't convinced. His attention dropped to the papers on the counter, then back to her. "That check," he said, his voice tightening. "Where did you get it?" A few nearby customers paused, their curiosity building, sensing something unfolding. The air grew heavier, attention shifting without anyone saying a word. The woman looked at the check, then back at him, her expression unchanged. "From the account it belongs to," she replied simply. That answer wasn't enough for him. Mark stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to feel more personal, more accusing. "I don't think you understand how serious this is." Still, she didn't flinch. She placed her hands calmly on the counter, as if grounding herself, as if the situation wasn't already escalating in ways most people couldn't see. Somewhere in the distance, a security camera blinked, silently recording everything. And that's when something subtle changed. Not loud, not dramatic, just a shift. The kind of shift that only happens when the story is about to turn in a direction no one in that room was prepared for. Mark's eyes narrowed as the woman stood there, calm in a way that unsettled him more than any argument ever could, and for a brief second he studied her face as if trying to place her in a world that did not quite fit his assumptions. "You are telling me this check is legitimate?" he asked, his tone controlled but edged with doubt. The teller behind the counter glanced between them, unsure whether to speak or stay silent. The woman gave a small nod, her voice steady and measured. "It is legitimate," she replied, without raising her voice. Around them, the quiet tension in the bank grew heavier. Customers now watching openly, sensing something unresolved but not understanding what it was. Mark exhaled slowly, then gestured toward the check. "Then you will not mind explaining it in detail," he said, as if offering her a final chance to cooperate. She met his gaze directly. "I already did," she said. Her words were simple, but they carried weight, the kind that did not rely on volume or force. Mark shifted slightly, crossing his arms as he looked at her with a mix of skepticism and irritation. "People come in here every day trying to pass off bad checks," he said, his voice rising just enough for nearby customers to hear. "And most of them say exactly what you just said." A few people exchanged glances, the implication hanging in the air. The woman did not react the way he expected. No anger, no panic, only a quiet stillness that seemed almost intentional. She glanced down at her phone for a brief moment, then back at him. That small movement, barely noticeable, did not escape his attention. "You are making this more complicated than it needs to be," he said, stepping closer. "If you cooperate, this will be easier for everyone." But even as he spoke, something in the room began to feel different. Not obvious, not loud, just a subtle shift in the energy, like the air itself had become more aware of what was happening. A second officer approached from the entrance, his steps measured as he took in the situation. "Everything okay here?" he asked, stopping beside Mark. Mark did not look away from the woman. "We have a situation involving a suspicious check," he replied. The second officer glanced at the document on the counter, then at the woman, his expression neutral but observant. "We will need to verify everything," he said calmly. The woman finally exhaled, a slow, controlled breath, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment. She placed both hands flat on the counter, steady and deliberate. "Then verify it," she said softly. Mark raised an eyebrow, taken aback by her composure. Most people would have been nervous, defensive, or angry by now. She was none of those things. And that, more than anything, made him uneasy. He reached toward the check again, but paused, something catching his attention. A faint vibration from her phone on the counter. She did not reach for it immediately. Instead, she simply let it sit there, the screen lighting up briefly before dimming again. Mark's eyes lingered on it for just a second longer than necessary. Then, without warning, the woman spoke again, her voice calm but carrying a quiet authority that seemed to settle the entire room into stillness. "Before you take another step," she said, looking directly at him, "you should be sure about what you are doing." Mark frowned slightly, sensing the warning but not fully understanding it. Around them, the bank remained frozen in that fragile moment, as if the next decision would determine something far larger than anyone realized. And somewhere beneath the surface of that silence, something was already in motion, waiting for the moment to reveal itself. The silence in the bank stretched on as if time itself had slowed, every eye in the room still fixed on the woman standing calmly at the counter. Officer Mark Reynolds did not move at first, his attention locked on her with growing suspicion, as if trying to read something that was just out of reach. The second officer shifted his stance slightly, his gaze moving between them, waiting for direction but not rushing to judgment. The woman remained composed, her hands still resting on the counter, her posture steady, her breathing controlled, as though she had already anticipated every possible outcome. Then Mark finally spoke again, his voice lower now, but firmer. "I am going to need identification," he said, his tone carrying the weight of procedure, though his eyes still held doubt. She did not respond immediately. Instead, she held his gaze for a moment longer, letting the silence settle between them. Then, slowly, she reached into her handbag, her movements calm and deliberate. The room seemed to hold its breath as she retrieved a small wallet, placing it gently on the counter. Mark's eyes followed every motion, his skepticism still present, but now mixed with something else, something closer to uncertainty. He took the wallet, opening it with care, expecting to find something that would confirm his suspicions. But as he flipped through the contents, his expression began to change, just slightly at first, then more noticeably as he reached the identification card inside. The second officer leaned in just enough to see, his eyes narrowing as he processed what he was looking at. The room itself seemed to shift again, the quiet murmur of customers fading into complete stillness. Mark stared at the identification, his brow tightening as he read the name and credentials. He looked up at her, then back down again, as if trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he believed to be true. "This is," he began, but his voice trailed off. The woman did not interrupt him. She simply waited, her expression unchanged, her presence steady and composed. A faint tension spread through the room, as if the air itself was tightening around the moment. The second officer exchanged a brief look with Mark, then spoke carefully. "We should verify this," he said, though his tone now carried a note of caution. Mark nodded slowly, still holding the identification in his hand, his earlier confidence beginning to give way to something more uncertain. Without a word, he stepped back slightly and reached for his radio, his eyes never leaving her. "Dispatch, I need verification on an identification," he said, his voice now more controlled than before. The woman watched him, her posture unchanged, her composure unwavering, as if she had already seen this moment unfold long before it happened. Around them, the customers continued to watch in silence, their attention now fully captured by the shift in energy, the quiet realization that something about this situation was not as simple as it first appeared. The seconds stretched, each one heavier than the last, until finally, Mark lowered the radio slightly, his expression tightening as he waited for a response. And in that waiting, in that fragile silence, the balance of control in the room began to shift in ways that no one could yet fully understand. The radio in Mark Reynolds' hand crackled with static as he stood frozen in place, the identification still gripped tightly in his fingers, his eyes fixed on the woman as if searching for a crack in the reality unfolding before him. Around them, the bank remained silent, every customer waiting, every breath held, as the moment stretched longer than anyone felt comfortable with. Then, finally, a voice came through the radio, calm, precise, and unmistakably official. Mark brought the device closer to his ear, listening carefully, his expression tightening with each passing second. The second officer watched him closely, sensing the shift even before it was spoken aloud. The woman did not move. She simply stood there, watching, her presence steady, her gaze unwavering. When the voice on the radio finished, Mark lowered the device slowly, his posture changing almost imperceptibly, as if the weight of what he had just heard had begun to settle into his understanding. He looked down at the identification again, then back at her, his earlier certainty now replaced by something far less stable. The second officer stepped forward slightly, his tone cautious. "What did they say?" he asked. Mark hesitated, just for a moment, then spoke, his voice quieter than before. "It checks out," he said. The words hung in the air, simple but heavy, carrying more meaning than he seemed ready to fully accept. The reaction in the room was immediate but subtle, a ripple of realization moving through the crowd as people began to process what that meant. The teller exhaled quietly, relief and confusion mixing in his expression. Mark looked back at the woman, studying her again, this time with a different kind of attention, one that carried uncertainty instead of authority. "You should have said something earlier," he said, though his tone lacked the confidence it once held. She met his gaze, her expression unchanged, her voice calm when she finally spoke. "I did," she replied. The simplicity of her answer seemed to echo louder than anything else in the room. The second officer glanced between them, then back at the identification still in Mark's hand. "We are going to need to stand down here," he said, his tone measured, his words careful. Mark nodded slowly, his grip on the ID loosening as he processed the shift in the situation. He took a step back, the distance between them now feeling different, as if the roles in the room had quietly begun to realign. The woman reached forward and took her identification back, placing it carefully into her wallet, her movements calm and deliberate, as though the entire exchange had been nothing more than a small interruption in her day. Around them, the tension that had filled the room moments ago began to ease, though not completely. People were still watching, still processing what had just happened, trying to reconcile what they had seen with what they thought they knew. Mark looked at her one more time, his expression conflicted, before finally lowering his gaze. For a moment, no one spoke. No one moved. And in that silence, something had changed in a way that could not be undone, because the balance of authority in the room had shifted, and for the first time since the encounter began, the person standing at the counter was no longer the one being judged, but the one quietly holding the truth. The quiet that followed seemed heavier than anything that had come before it, stretching across the bank like an invisible pressure that no one knew how to break. Officer Mark Reynolds stood a few feet away now, his posture no longer rigid with authority, but softened by something far less certain, his eyes occasionally shifting between the woman and the identification that had just been verified. The second officer remained composed, though his attention was now focused on procedure rather than suspicion, his stance relaxed but alert. Around them, customers began to shift in their places, some returning to their tasks, others still watching with lingering curiosity, as if trying to understand what had just changed. The woman remained at the counter, her presence steady, her expression calm, as if the entire interaction had been no more than a brief interruption in her day. She adjusted her posture slightly, placing her wallet back into her bag with deliberate care, her movements unhurried and precise. Mark cleared his throat, adjusting his stance as he spoke again, though his voice now lacked the same certainty it had carried earlier. "We are going to move forward with verification," he said, more as a formality than a command. She nodded once, acknowledging the statement without adding anything further. There was no tension in her response, no need to assert anything beyond what had already been established. Yet something about her silence carried weight, a quiet confidence that lingered in the space between them. The teller, now visibly more at ease, returned to his screen, typing in details as he continued the transaction, though his movements were slower, more careful than before. The second officer glanced around the room, then back at Mark, as if silently confirming that the situation was under control. But Mark did not respond immediately. His attention remained on the woman, his mind still processing the shift that had taken place. He had approached this moment with certainty, with the expectation of authority, and yet now he found himself standing in a space where that certainty no longer applied in the way it once had. The woman finally spoke again, her voice calm and measured, cutting gently through the silence. "You were doing your job," she said, her tone neither confrontational nor dismissive. "But you should always be certain before making assumptions." The words landed softly, but their meaning carried weight. Mark looked down briefly, then nodded once, a small acknowledgement that carried more understanding than anything he had said earlier. The second officer gave a slight nod as well, recognizing the subtle shift in perspective. Around them, the atmosphere continued to settle, the tension gradually dissolving into the ordinary rhythm of the bank once more. But the moment had left its mark, not through conflict, but through realization. The woman stood for a moment longer, then stepped back from the counter, her transaction now complete, her purpose in that space fulfilled. As she turned to leave, the room seemed to part slightly, a quiet acknowledgement without words. Mark watched her go, his expression thoughtful, as if something about the encounter would stay with him longer than he expected. And as she reached the door and stepped outside into the daylight, there was a sense that the story was not over, but had only just begun to reveal what lay beneath the surface of everything they thought they understood. The city outside the bank had already moved on, cars passing by, people walking under the afternoon sun as if nothing unusual had happened inside. Yet inside that quiet building something subtle continued to unfold beneath the surface of what everyone thought was normal. Officer Mark Reynolds stood near the entrance now, one hand resting lightly on his belt, his posture no longer tense but thoughtful, as if replaying the moment in his mind again and again. The second officer had returned to his position, speaking quietly into his radio, confirming that all procedures had been completed, his tone steady and professional. Inside the bank, customers resumed their transactions, though some still glanced toward the entrance, remembering the moment when everything had seemed uncertain. The teller finished processing the transaction, offering a polite nod as the woman completed her business without further delay. She adjusted her bag over her shoulder, her movements calm and composed, then turned toward the exit. As she walked past Mark, she paused briefly, just enough for him to notice. Their eyes met for a moment, and in that silence between them, something unspoken passed. Not tension, not conflict, but awareness. "You handled that well," she said softly, her voice carrying no judgment, only acknowledgement. Mark blinked slightly, caught off guard by the statement. He nodded once, though his expression remained conflicted, as if still trying to understand what he had just experienced. "Thank you," he replied, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier certainty. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, then continued toward the exit, pushing the door open as natural light spilled into the room behind her. For a moment, the contrast between the inside and outside felt symbolic, like two different perspectives meeting at a single point before separating again. Mark watched her step outside, her figure disappearing into the flow of people beyond the glass doors. The second officer approached him, standing beside him in silence for a moment before speaking. "You were thorough," he said, his tone neutral but respectful. Mark nodded, though his thoughts were elsewhere. "I should have verified sooner," he admitted quietly. The second officer did not argue. He simply nodded, acknowledging the reflection. Outside, the woman walked along the sidewalk, her pace steady, her presence blending into the rhythm of the city. Yet there was something different now. Not visible to others, but present nonetheless. The way she carried herself, the way she moved through the world, suggested a level of awareness that extended beyond the ordinary. She reached into her pocket, retrieving her phone, and for a brief moment, her expression changed just slightly as she looked at the screen. "Hey!" Message had come through. She paused for a moment, standing still among the flow of pedestrians, then tapped the screen, reading the brief but important update. Her eyes lifted slowly, scanning the street ahead, as if seeing something others could not. The moment in the bank had ended, but the work she was truly there for had not. Across the city, somewhere beyond what anyone in that bank could see, pieces were already beginning to move into place. And as she continued walking forward, disappearing into the crowd, one thing remained clear. What had just happened inside that bank was only a small part of something much larger, something that had been in motion long before anyone realized, and something that was far from finished revealing itself. The streets were alive with motion, yet inside her mind there was only stillness as the woman walked forward through the city, her pace steady, her presence unshaken by the earlier encounter that had unfolded behind her. The sunlight reflected off glass buildings, casting long, shifting patterns across the sidewalk as people passed by, none of them aware of the weight carried in her quiet composure. She kept her gaze forward, her steps measured, each one intentional, as if following a path that only she could see. Her phone vibrated again, drawing her attention, and this time she answered without hesitation, lifting it to her ear as she slowed her pace slightly. "I am in position," she said calmly, her voice low but precise, carrying no trace of uncertainty. On the other end, a voice responded with equal clarity, confirming details that remained unknown to anyone around her. As she listened, her eyes scanned the surrounding area, not with suspicion, but with awareness, as though mapping connections that others could not perceive. A delivery truck passed by, a group of pedestrians crossed the street, and in the distance, a security camera rotated slowly, tracking movement without drawing attention. She ended the call, lowering the phone back into her hand, her expression unchanged, though her focus had sharpened. Somewhere ahead, a destination awaited her, one that had nothing to do with the bank and everything to do with what had been quietly unfolding beneath the surface. She adjusted her direction slightly, turning down a side street, her footsteps echoing softly against the pavement. The city around her continued its rhythm, cars passing, voices blending, into a constant background hum, but she moved through it all with purpose. Moments later, she stopped near the entrance of a building that appeared unremarkable at first glance, its exterior blending seamlessly into the surrounding environment. She looked up at it briefly, then stepped forward and entered without hesitation. Inside, the atmosphere was quieter, more controlled, with minimal activity and a sense of order that contrasted with the energy of the street outside. A receptionist looked up as she approached, recognition flashing across their face before they quickly composed themselves. "You are expected," the receptionist said, gesturing toward a secure hallway. The woman gave a slight nod, then continued forward, her steps echoing softly as she moved deeper into the building. The door at the end of the hall opened automatically, revealing a room where several monitors displayed live feeds, data streams, and communications in constant motion. She stepped inside, her presence immediately acknowledged by the people already there, who turned their attention toward her without needing to ask who she was. "Report," one of them said, their tone calm but focused. She placed her phone on the table, then straightened slightly, her voice steady as she began to speak. "The initial interaction is complete. The target location has been observed. Confirmation is in progress." The room remained quiet as she continued, her words precise, every detail accounted for. On one of the screens, a live feed from the bank replayed the earlier moment, capturing the shift in control, the verification, and the realization that had unfolded. She glanced at the screen briefly, then returned her focus to the room. "They are beginning to understand," she added, her tone carrying a quiet certainty. No one responded immediately. Instead, the group exchanged brief looks, acknowledging the significance of what she had said. Outside, the city continued without pause, unaware that beneath its surface, a larger operation was already in motion, one that had been carefully planned, precisely executed, and now quietly advancing toward its next phase, with the woman at its center moving forward, step by step, toward whatever came next. Inside the secure facility, the atmosphere had shifted into something far more focused, the quiet hum of equipment filling the space as monitors displayed streams of information that most people would never see or understand. The woman stood near the center of the room, her posture composed, her attention fully engaged as she listened to the updates being presented. Around her, the team moved with purpose, each person handling their task with precision, their expressions serious but controlled, as if every detail mattered, because it did. "We have confirmation of financial irregularities across multiple accounts tied to that location," one of the analysts said, pointing to a series of data points on the screen. The woman nodded slightly, her eyes tracking the information as it appeared, her mind already connecting patterns that others were still processing. "Expand the scope," she said calmly, her voice steady but directive. "There are more layers beneath what we are seeing." The analyst responded immediately, adjusting the system to pull additional data, the screens shifting as new information began to load. In another part of the room, a second monitor displayed a live feed, capturing the inside of the bank from earlier, frozen at a moment that now carried deeper meaning. The woman stepped closer to it, studying the scene with quiet intensity, her gaze fixed on the interactions that had unfolded. "This was never about a single transaction," she said softly, more to herself than to the room. One of the team members looked toward her. "You were testing their response," they said, as if confirming a theory. She gave a slight nod, and they revealed more than they realized. The room remained silent for a moment, the weight of her words settling over the group. Then another screen lit up, drawing attention to a new set of data. "We have movement," another voice said. "Several accounts are now attempting to transfer funds simultaneously." The woman turned her attention back to the screens, her focus sharpening as she studied the activity. "That confirms it," she said. "They are reacting to exposure." Her tone remained calm, but there was a quiet certainty in her voice, a sense that everything was unfolding exactly as planned. She walked slowly across the room, her eyes never leaving the displays, each step measured, each movement intentional. "Lock the transfers," she said, "and trace the origin points." The team responded without hesitation, executing her instructions with precision. Outside the facility, the world continued without awareness of what was happening beneath its surface. People went about their day, unaware that systems were being monitored, patterns were being tracked, and decisions were being made that would affect far more than a single moment in a bank. Back in the room, the woman stopped walking, her attention returning to the live feed once more. The image showed the bank, now calm, now ordinary, as if nothing had happened. But she knew better. "They think it ended," she said quietly. "But it has only just begun." No one responded. They did not need to. They understood that what had started as a simple interaction had now expanded into something much larger, something that required patience, precision, and absolute control. And as the screens continued to update, the signals continued to move, and the operation advanced one step further into its next phase. The woman stood at the center of it all, calm, focused, and already several steps ahead of everything that was about to unfold. The room was quieter now, the kind of quiet that follows movement, where everything is still processing, still settling, but nothing has truly stopped. The woman stood in front of the central display, her eyes focused, her posture unchanged, as if she had already reached the end of the path while others were just beginning to understand its direction. The screens around her continued to update, lines of data shifting, connections forming, patterns revealing themselves one layer at a time. One of the team members broke the silence. "We have successfully isolated the source," they said, their voice steady, but with a trace of confirmation that this was the moment they had been working toward. The woman nodded once, her gaze fixed on the information displayed in front of her. "Then we proceed," she said calmly. "No hesitation, no doubt, just forward motion." Another monitor flickered, showing a series of accounts being flagged, their activity now under scrutiny, their movements tracked with precision. The earlier interaction at the bank was no longer isolated. It had become a key point in a much larger network of observation and response. "There are additional links," another analyst said, "connections that extend beyond this location." The woman turned slightly, acknowledging the statement. "Map them," she replied. "Every connection matters." The team moved quickly, each person executing their role with quiet efficiency, their focus aligned, their purpose clear. For a brief moment, the only sound in the room was the soft tapping of keys and the subtle shifting of data across screens. Then, one of the monitors displayed something new. A notification. A confirmation. A result. The analyst looked up. "All flagged transactions have been secured," they said. "Access has been restricted." The woman did not respond immediately. She simply observed, taking in the result, the culmination of everything that had been set into motion. Then, slowly she spoke. "That was never the objective," she said. The room shifted slightly in attention, curiosity rising. She turned toward the group, her expression calm but certain. This was about awareness, she continued. Understanding how systems respond when they are challenged, and how quickly they adapt when something does not align with expectation. A quiet understanding began to spread among the team. This was not just about enforcement. It was about insight, about revealing what could not be seen from the outside. One of the monitors returned to the live feed from the bank. The scene remained unchanged. Ordinary, calm, unaware of the depth of what had occurred beneath its surface. The woman approached the screen, studying it one final time. Then she spoke, her voice soft but clear. "They will remember this moment," she said, "even if they do not understand why." No one replied. There was no need. Outside the facility, the city continued its rhythm, the streets filled with movement, the sky stretching wide above buildings that stood as if nothing had changed. But something had changed. Not visibly, not immediately, but deeply. A shift had taken place, quiet and deliberate, like the turning of a page in a story that had only just begun to reveal its full scope. The woman stepped back from the screen, her work for the moment complete. But her presence remained, steady, grounded, and aware that what had been set into motion would continue long after this moment had passed. And as the monitors dimmed slightly, and the team settled into the next phase of their work, one thing became clear. This was not the end. It was the beginning of understanding. And understanding, once reached, could not be undone.